In the heart of a sprawling wildlife sanctuary, a highly anticipated meeting is about to take place. On one side, Sadie, a cheetah rescued from a life of confinement, a powerful runner who never had the space to stretch her legs. On the other, Max, a former exotic pet, a bobcat who looks the part but has forgotten how to be wild. Different continents, different instincts, different everything. But both are outcasts. Both are profoundly alone. The team at the sanctuary had spent 6 weeks planning this moment, preparing for every possibility. They had intended for them to meet calmly, but the situation quickly became unpredictable, and they were not prepared for what happened next. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Dan Matthews, the director of the Harmony Hills Wildlife Sanctuary, ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, a gesture so familiar it was practically a part of his job description. He stood on the observation deck overlooking the acclimation yard, a lush 2-acre enclosure designed for the delicate dance of animal introductions. Today's performance, however, had all the subtlety of a monster truck rally. "Well," he said to the two people beside him, Brenda and Kevin, "that didn't go as planned." Below them, a cheetah, sleek and spotted, paced the far fence line with the fluid grace of a river of gold. That was Sadie. On the opposite side, hunkered down behind a strategically placed and now very much appreciated boulder, was a bobcat. That was Max. The plan, carefully crafted over 6 weeks of meetings, scent swapping, and enclosure sharing schedules, had been for a calm, controlled meeting. Nature, as it often did, had laughed at their plans, crumpled them up, and set them on fire. The initial introduction had lasted approximately 90 seconds. Max, a creature of boundless, misplaced confidence, had strutted into the yard as if he owned it. Sadie, who had been rescued from a bankrupt roadside zoo where she'd been kept in a concrete pen, had never seen another feline that wasn't a reflection. She saw Max, a bundle of tufted-eared, stubby-tailed bravado, and reacted with the only instinct she had: a defensive, guttural hiss that sounded like a steam pipe bursting. Max, who had never backed down from anything, including a grumpy badger and a rogue lawnmower at his previous, ill-advised home, froze mid-strut. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He'd then executed a comical, scrambling retreat, all 4 paws pinwheeling in the dirt, and dived behind the boulder, where he'd remained for the last 20 minutes. "I think we surprised him," Kevin, the youngest member of the team, offered with a nervous chuckle. Kevin was Max's primary caregiver, a bond forged through countless hours of patience and offerings of high-grade salmon. "You think?" Brenda retorted, though her voice was laced with worry, not admonishment. Brenda was Sadie's rock. She was a woman in her late 50s with a calm demeanor that could soothe the most anxious of animals. She'd spent months teaching Sadie that the world was bigger than a 10 by 10 cage, and that humans could be a source of comfort, not just a bucket of questionable meat. "She's just scared, Dan. She's never had to share her space." Dan nodded, his eyes fixed on the 2 disparate figures below. "I know, Bren. It's a lot for both of them. Let's give them a minute to reset." He raised his walkie-talkie. "All right, team. Let's let Sadie into the outer pasture. Give Max the yard to himself for a bit. Let him get his sea legs back." The story of how a bobcat and a cheetah came to be in the same introduction yard in rural North Carolina was a tale of 2 very different, very American tragedies. Max had been purchased as an exotic kitten by a wealthy tech bro in Silicon Valley who thought owning a bobcat would be a quirky personality trait. The reality was a clawed-up leather sofa, a terrified Persian cat named Muffin, and a final straw involving an incident with a very expensive sushi delivery. When the authorities intervened, they found a confused, declawed, and slightly overweight bobcat who had no idea how to be a bobcat. He couldn't hunt, he couldn't climb properly without his claws, and his only instinct was to puff up his chest and act tough until someone gave him a piece of tuna. He was completely non-releasable, a wild creature stripped of his wildness. He was transferred to Harmony Hills, where he quickly became a local legend, known for his grumpy face and his secret love of belly rubs from Kevin. But he was lonely. The other bobcats, all true wild rescues, regarded him with disdain. He was an outcast, a house cat in a predator's body. Sadie's story was quieter, but no less heartbreaking. She was born at a squalid roadside attraction in Florida that billed itself as a big cat adventure. Her adventure consisted of being used as a photo prop until she grew too large, then being relegated to a barren pen. She was a cheetah who had never truly run. When the facility was shut down for a litany of animal welfare violations, Sadie was a ghost, underweight, terrified of loud noises, and profoundly solitary. Brenda had worked a miracle with her. Through endless patience, she'd coaxed Sadie out of her shell. She'd watched, tears in her eyes, the first time Sadie had opened up into a full sprint in her multi-acre enclosure, a golden blur of rediscovered instinct. But like Max, she was alone. Cheetahs in the wild are often solitary, but they have complex social interactions. Sadie had none. She was the queen of a lonely kingdom. The idea to introduce them had been Dan's, a long shot born of late-night pondering. Neither animal could be with their own kind. Max was too domesticated. Sadie was too traumatized. But perhaps, just perhaps, two lonely outcasts from different continents could find some common ground. They were both felines after all. They spoke a similar, if accented, language of tail flicks and ear twitches. "It's a cross-continental Lonely Hearts Club," Dan had explained at the initial staff meeting, to a series of skeptical looks. "What's the worst that can happen? They ignore each other? They're already doing that in separate enclosures." Now, watching Max peek his whiskered face out from behind the boulder, Dan felt a familiar pang of anxiety. The worst that could happen was much, well, worse than them ignoring each other. Down in the yard, Kevin's voice crackled over the radio, soft and encouraging. "Come on, buddy. The coast is clear. She's gone." Max, hearing the voice of his favorite human, tentatively emerged. He shook his ruffled fur, stretched one leg, then the other, and looked around the empty yard with an expression that seemed to say, "Yeah, I scared her off, just as I planned." From the observation deck, Brenda snorted. "Look at him, all puff and no powder." As if on cue, a new wave of tension rippled through the scene. Sadie, in the adjacent pasture, had spotted Max. She wasn't pacing anymore. She was standing statue still, her head low, her tail giving a slow, almost imperceptible flick at the tip. It wasn't aggressive. It was curious. Max, feeling her gaze, froze. He looked over at the fence separating the two enclosures. His ears, with their distinctive black tufts, swiveled like radar dishes, trying to process the information. This giant, long-legged cat wasn't a threat to be chased off. She was still there, and she was watching him. Slowly, almost painfully, Max began to walk towards the fence. It was not his usual swagger. This was a hesitant, cautious walk, each paw placed with deliberation. "Okay," Dan whispered into his radio. "Everyone stay quiet. Don't move. Let him go." The air grew thick with unspoken hope. This was it. This was the moment that would decide if Dan's crazy idea had any merit. Max reached the fence. Sadie, on her side, took a corresponding step forward. They were now only a few feet apart, separated by the chain link mesh. Sadie lowered her head and let out a soft sound. It wasn't a hiss or a growl. It was a strange bird-like chirp, a sound unique to cheetahs. Chirp. Max flinched, startled by the unfamiliar noise. He took a half step back, his stubby tail twitching nervously. "It's okay, Max," Kevin murmured, his voice a low hum. "She's just saying hello." On the deck, Brenda held her breath. "Come on, Sadie girl," she whispered to herself. "Show him you're not so scary." Sadie chirped again, a little louder this time. Then she did something that made Dan's jaw drop. She lay down. Not in a pounce, not in a defensive crouch, but a full, relaxed flop onto the grass, her long legs tucked beneath her. It was a gesture of sublime submission, a clear signal that she meant no harm. From behind his boulder, Max had seen enough. His innate curiosity, the one part of his wild self that hadn't been scrubbed out by domestication, was overriding his fear. He saw the big, scary cat lying down. This was new. This was interesting. He crept forward, his belly low to the ground, a miniature tawny predator on a mission of reconnaissance. He reached the spot where Sadie had been standing moments before and lowered his nose to the ground, inhaling deeply. His whiskers twitched, processing a world of information from the scent she'd left behind. Female, feline, not a threat, smells nice. "Look at that," Kevin breathed, a wide grin spreading across his face. "He's getting bolder." Dan keyed the radio. "Brenda, what do you think? Should we open the gate?" There was a long pause. Brenda's eyes were locked on Sadie, who was now watching Max with an intensity that was both regal and gentle. "She's relaxed, Dan. Her tail is still, her ears are forward. She's just watching. I think we can try. Slowly." The plan was enacted with the precision of a silent film. A handler, moving with practiced slowness, unlatched the gate between the pasture and the yard. It swung open with a soft groan. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sadie stood up, her movements deliberate. She looked at the open gate, then at Max, who was still sniffing the ground with rapt attention. Then she walked through the opening. She didn't run. She didn't charge. She ambled. She entered the acclimation yard and stopped about 30 feet from the still oblivious Bobcat. "Okay, Max," Kevin whispered. "Turn around, buddy. Easy now." Max, having apparently learned everything he needed to from that patch of dirt, finally lifted his head and froze. The giant cat was back, and she was in his yard, and the gate was open. His little Bobcat brain seemed to short-circuit. All his instincts screamed at him to either puff up his chest or run for the hills. He did a little of both. He arched his back, his fur bristling, making him look like a furry, angry apostrophe. But his feet were already shuffling backward. Sadie just watched him, her head tilted. Then she let out another sound. This one wasn't a chirp. It was a low, rumbling noise, like a distant freight train starting its engine. It was a purr. A cheetah's purr is a formidable thing, a resonant, body-shaking vibration that you feel as much as you hear. Brrrr. Max stopped shuffling. The noise was bizarre, unnerving, but also not threatening. It was, in its own way, calming. He lowered his back slightly. "She's purring," Brenda said over the radio, her voice thick with emotion. "I've never heard her purr like that for anyone but me." The tension in the air began to melt away, replaced by a fragile sense of wonder. The two animals stood there, a study in contrasts. Sadie, the epitome of streamlined grace, all long limbs and elegant spots. Max, a compact bundle of muscle and grit, all tufts and tenacity. An African queen and an Appalachian brawler. Sadie, seeing that Max was no longer in full-on panic mode, took another step, then another. Max held his ground, his stubby tail giving a single nervous flick. They were now 10 feet apart. The sanctuary was so quiet you could hear the buzz of a fly. Sadie lowered her head and extended her nose. The invitation was clear. Max, after a moment of internal debate that was almost visible on his whiskered face, took a hesitant step forward. He mirrored her posture, extending his own nose. They were inches apart now, sniffing, gathering the final, crucial pieces of information. "Don't anyone move a muscle," Dan whispered. "No petting, no talking above a whisper. Let them have their moment." Suddenly, Max broke the spell. Perhaps a scent was too strong, or a whisker tickled him the wrong way. But he flinched back with a sudden, jerky movement and a small, startled hiss. Sadie reacted instantly. She leaped back, not in aggression, but in surprise, her long legs coiling under her like springs. For a heart-stopping second, the old fear was back in her eyes. The handlers tensed, hands hovering over their tranquilizer guns. But then, the moment passed. Max, realizing his overreaction, immediately relaxed. He shook his head as if to clear it. Sadie, seeing him calm down, visibly deflated, the tension leaving her body in a rush. It was a critical test, and they had passed it. They had startled each other, and neither had escalated. They were learning to respect each other's boundaries. A wave of relief washed over the humans. Kevin let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky. "Okay, that was progress." To break the residual tension, Brenda decided it was time for positive reinforcement. She signaled to a handler who tossed a few small, specially made cat-safe meatballs into the yard, halfway between the two animals. Max, whose stomach often ruled his brain, trotted over to a meatball immediately. Sadie, however, was more delicate. She watched Max gobble his down before she daintily picked one up, her gaze never leaving the bobcat. This seemed to fascinate Max. He finished his treat and watched her, a look of grudging respect on his face. This big, weird-sounding cat was polite. She had manners. The mood had lightened considerably. The air of a high-stakes diplomatic summit had been replaced by something resembling a slightly awkward garden party. And then, the game began. It started with Sadie. She finished her treat and, feeling a bit more confident, gave a playful little hop, batting at a stray leaf. Max's predator instincts, dulled as they were, flickered to life. He saw the movement, the hop, the batted leaf. He crouched down, his stubby tail wiggling, the universal feline sign for, "I'm about to do something fun." He pounced. It was a clumsy, flat-footed pounce that landed him a good 2 feet short of Sadie, but the intent was clear. He wanted to play. Sadie, who had likely never been invited to play in her entire life, looked momentarily confused. Then a switch flipped. She responded with a graceful, bounding leap away from him, landing softly before looking back over her shoulder, a clear invitation in her golden eyes. What followed was the most bizarre and heartwarming game of tag Dan had ever witnessed. Max, with his short, powerful legs, was quick in short bursts. Sadie, with her lanky frame, was built for long-distance speed she couldn't possibly use in this space. So she adapted. She would let Max get close, then bound away in a series of light-footed, prancing hops, always staying just out of reach. It was a soft, gentle chase, a conversation spoken in movement. Kevin and Brenda were laughing now, the sound soft and joyous. "Go on, Maxie," Kevin cheered quietly. "You show that supermodel how we do it downtown." Sadie, in her excitement, began making her train noises again, a series of purrs and chirps that sounded utterly comical coming from such an elegant creature. She sounded like a rusty engine trying to start on a cold morning, a funny, rumbling soundtrack to their game. The play session went on for 10 minutes, a whirlwind of spotted gold and tawny brown. They chased, they tumbled, or rather, Max tumbled, and they rested, panting, a respectful distance apart. Then came the moment that the staff would talk about for years. Sadie was resting, panting lightly, when a large grasshopper made the fatal mistake of landing a few feet in front of her. Her focus narrowed instantly. The playful domestic cat vanished, and for a split second, the apex predator emerged. Her body coiled, her muscles bunched. Max saw it too. He dropped into a crouch, his own hunting instincts, buried deep beneath layers of salmon and belly rubs kicking in. For a single unified moment, they were not a cheetah and a bobcat. They were hunters. They were a team. Sadie launched. Max launched a half-second later. It was what a handler later called the failed hunt of the century. Sadie, in her explosive grace, completely overshot the grasshopper, landing 5 feet beyond it. Max, in his earnest clumsiness, landed directly on the spot where the grasshopper had been. But the insect, sensing its doom, had already leaped to safety. The two cats skidded to a halt, finding themselves nose to nose in a cloud of dust, both looking utterly bewildered. They had failed. Together. They stared at each other, panting. The grasshopper was gone. The thrill of the hunt had vanished, and in its place was a new understanding. Max looked at Sadie, and for the first time, there was no fear, no bravado, just a shared moment of comical failure. Sadie broke the silence. She leaned forward and gave Max's tufted ear a quick, rough lick. It was so unexpected, so contrary to everything they thought might happen, that Max stumbled back, shaking his head as if he had water in his ear. He looked at Sadie, then at the humans on the deck, then back at Sadie, his expression a perfect mixture of confusion and indignation. A lick? From this giant, long-legged, train-sounding creature? What was that? A thank you? An insult? An appetizer? Brenda's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob of pure joy. Kevin was just shaking his head, a huge, goofy grin on his face. Dan keyed his radio one last time, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Okay, team," he said, his voice cracking. "I think that's enough excitement for one day. Let's bring them in." The separation was as gentle as the introduction had been chaotic. Kevin called to Max, who, after one last confused look at Sadie, trotted obediently towards the gate to his own enclosure, his mind clearly still reeling from the unexpected grooming session. Brenda walked into the yard herself to get Sadie. The cheetah trotted to her, purring her freight train purr, and rubbed her head against Brenda's leg. But as Brenda led her away, Sadie kept looking back over her shoulder at the bobcat disappearing through the opposite gate. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the North Carolina hills, the sanctuary was quiet. In his enclosure, Max lay on his favorite wooden platform, not sleeping, but staring across the grassy expanse towards Sadie's habitat. He wasn't posturing. He was just watching. And in her enclosure, Sadie lay on a bed of soft hay, her regal head up, her golden eyes fixed on the small, tawny shape in the distance. The frantic pacing was gone. The nervous energy had settled. For the first time since she'd arrived at Harmony Hills, she looked truly peaceful. She looked like she was home. Up on the observation deck, Dan stood alone, watching the two of them. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and unpredictable and took a whole lot of patience. But looking at the two lonely souls, a declawed bobcat from California and a traumatized cheetah from Florida, finding a fragile, unlikely peace under a Carolina sky, he knew his crazy idea had been the best one he'd ever had. What happened next surprised everyone, himself most of all. It wasn't a dramatic clash or a fearful retreat. It was quieter, stranger, and infinitely more beautiful. It was the beginning of a friendship.